In 2009, delegates representing their countries debated about how the world could prevent its destiny of becoming too hot, too polluted and too dangerous for every species living on it. Nothing really changed. Already in 1997, these delegates negotiated sentence by sentence what measures had to be taken. It was back then when the world leaders decided that capitalism could save our planet. Again. Because we do not want to live without our electric devices, heavy machinery and the luxury of our lifestyle, we cannot avoid pictures like this. We must produce a lot of energy in order to get our batteries charged. Like most industrialized countries, the EU relies heavily on fossil fuels. Roughly 75% of all energy is produced by burning coal, oil and gases. This emits a lot of CO2 and other greenhouse gases.
The United Nations calculated that the fairest rate of CO2 emissions per person would be an annual rate of 1.7 tons. The atmosphere cannot absorb more. Currently, a Zambian emits 0.2 tons, a Chinese 4.7 tons, and an average EU citizen 10.2 tons. That's 8.5 tons more than the climate can take. Since the Kyoto Protocol, every country distributes carbon quotas to its polluting industries. The idea is to hand out fewer quotas than required in order to incite companies to reduce their emissions. Furthermore, a carbon market was created. Companies that manage to cut their emissions to the point that they possess spare quotas may sell them. Other polluting companies that are unwilling or unable to cut their emissions may now buy these quotas. Leaving it to the companies, this system was quickly bypassed. The Kyoto Protocol allowed companies to cut emissions, not only within their own facilities, but also elsewhere. Through financing emission-reducing projects in developing countries, companies could obtain quotas that they could use to keep their own structures running. What was thought to be an economic and humanitarian approach turned out to be a bureaucratic nightmare that facilitated fraud and brought the carbon market to the brink of being a farce. In Copenhagen, 12 years after Kyoto, the problems were evident, but the world's leaders once more failed to implement decisive measures.
Meanwhile, the private sector has come up with its own way to reduce greenhouse gas emission: CO2 compensation. Did they just downsize the inefficient international structures? Or might this actually be a constructive approach?
Organic, natural, climate-friendly. The CEOs of big marketing companies do not hesitate exploiting our bad conscience and suggest that doing something good for the environment is not only fantastic, but it is a lifestyle we can purchase. No matter who you are, there is always an environmentally friendly product you can buy to underline your sense for nature and our little climatic problem. The German brewery Krombacher started their very own project of saving the planet. 1 box of Krombacher beer purchased saves 1 square meter of rainforest somewhere far away from home. Caring about the environment and climate change has not only become an advertising strategy for companies, but it is also fashionable for the consumer. One of the most serious approaches is the voluntary offset for air travel carbon emissions. Up to 2 billion passengers have to be transported every year around the globe. A few years ago, aviation companies like Lufthansa thus started to do something for the environment. Emission trading is possible for you too, my fellow passenger. My Climate is a Swiss organization specialized in this voluntary offset for air travel carbon emissions. With the help of a very easy-to-use calculator on their website, You can assess the compensation payment you should pay for your flight or other activities that emitted CO2, like your car journeys or even your energy use at home. Let's pretend we fly from Berlin to Brussels, business as usual for future diplomats and high-ranking managers, right? Covering a flight distance of 1,294 kilometers, the emission of CO2 would account for 0.339 tons. We go a bit further and imagine that the UN invites us for a conference of the UNFCCC. Thus, we have to get from Brussels to New York. The numbers here are quite big. Covering a flight distance of 11,786 kilometers this time, the emission of CO2 would account for 2.509 tons. To compensate the amount of CO2 emissions in underdeveloped and developing countries, you would have to pay 8 euros for your first journey and 57 euros for the second one. On the contrary, the costs for reducing emissions in Switzerland are significantly higher. 32 euros for the flight bill in Brussels and 230 euros to visit the conference of the UNFCCC in New York. The difference between the two compensation payments can be explained like this. You can choose whether you want to spend your money in national climate protection projects, like the construction of new solar panels in Switzerland, or prefer to spend it in foreign projects that are often related to humanitarian aid too, like increasing the energy efficiency in Peru, for example. At first sight, this corresponds with what the big players are doing on a large scale. They are spending money to reduce CO2 emissions somewhere else to be able to use their fossil fuel burning power plants to full capacity.
If we calculate the same journey with the calculator of Atmosphere, another leading organization in voluntary offsets, we will not get the same results. For the first journey, we would emit 0.38 tons and pay 10 euros. The emissions of CO2 for the flight to New York would account for 3.92 tons. We would thus have to pay 91 euros. These numbers differ clearly from those obtained previously on the page of MyClimate. 10 euros from Berlin to Brussels, between 100 and 230 euros for the flight to New York. The varying numbers show a very controversial aspect of voluntary offsets. How do the organizations calculate the emissions and the compensation payment? What factors do they take into account? Stefan Baumeister, director of MyClimate Germany in Reutlingen, explains how the numbers are calculated and depicts the difficulties involved.
MyClimate, for example, calculates the amount of money with the help of a group of experts, researchers and scientists on the field of climate change and CO2 emission. But unfortunately, there is no approximate value for the calculation given by organizations such as the IPCC and the UNFCCC. Basically, every company has its own way of assessing these figures. The factors taken into account for the calculation are the exact distance of the flight as well as the frequency rate of the flight and the flight attitude. MyClimate recommends a coefficient taking into account further effects than just CO2 emissions, but most airlines insist on a lower coefficient, contesting the intensity of their impact on the climate. TUI Fly is the only company accepting the coefficient recommended by MyClimate scientists.
The inconsistency in the payment calculations shows how immature the sector still is. Besides, there are other aspects putting compensation into question. Dietrich Brockhagen, CEO of the voluntary offset organization Atmosphere, explained the misconceptions about his work. First of all, the terms of neutrality and compensation are problematic in themselves. They suggest that the travel has no impact on the climate and that voluntary offset is already the solution we were looking for. In fact, it is only a try to work around the inefficiency of our technologies. Compensation is only the second best solution. The best choice would be not to fly at all, until we can do so without emitting CO2. Another factor of insecurity are the emission-reducing projects supported by the voluntary offset organizations. By establishing standards for such projects, the organizations try to improve the transparency of their services. The important difference to the international quota market discussed earlier lies in the motivation behind the actions. Individuals paying money to compensate their emissions do so because they choose to. Their personal benefit is nothing but moral. Voluntary offset organizations, such as MyClimate or Atmosphere, are somewhat similar to charity organizations. In the end, it boils down to a measure of trust about the good intentions of the compensation service and its projects.
A lot of donators expect us to invest in local carbon offset projects in their countries. But we always have to bear in mind that when we support a project in India, it goes beyond caring only for the climate. Carbon offset projects are mostly part of humanitarian aid as well. Sometimes MyClimate has to work with people who have never heard about climate change. It means MyClimate's work is also in prevention and education. Climate change is not a local problem, it's a global one. We all have to deal with it, no matter where we live on this planet.
In the end, voluntary offset organizations have to be taken for what they are. They are not the solution for our lack of green energy. They are rather an attempt to minimize the impact of our current inept technology. Furthermore, they fulfill a humanitarian purpose. Therefore, they can be considered to be a special climate-related charity. Although they might not be the most effective way to protect our climate, they serve a legitimate purpose. In order to maximize their impact, they still have to improve their transparency and visibility. Baumeister admits that only a very little number of all passengers use compensation payment. Far below 1% of Lufthansa passengers use the service, while amongst TUI Fly passengers the rate is slightly higher, at about 3%. Baumeister relates this gap to the two different implementations of compensation payments within the two booking systems. The easier the compensation can be done, the more passengers choose to do it. Baumeister also explains that people need more motivation to compensate their emissions. The possibility to show to others that one compensates his emissions might be a way to motivate people. Social networks might play a role in this. Maybe one day, airplanes will have an entire green class for climate-conscious passengers. In any case, much is left to be done.